All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see a few faces that we're familiar with. And my name is Brad Warren. I run Global Ocean Health, and I'll sort of do the introduction to get us started and pass the mic here in a minute to Francesca Hillary, who's going to be emceeing and moderating in this session. And Francesca works with us on a lot on this project and on many others, doing partnership development. And the we're coming up on the tail end of this series. There'll be one more, and then there may be a pause while we pull in new funding to keep this going. We will continue. We're just going to have to raise money to keep going. Yeah. And with that, I'll pass it to Francesca.
Thank you, Brad, and welcome everyone. This is the third session of our Forest Biomass Learning Network. It's hosted by us, Global Ocean Health, in collaboration with the Carbon Business Council, American University's Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal, and the Indigenous Greenhouse Gas Removal Commission, which we helped to support the launch of a couple years ago. This session will explore how forest residuals can be converted into a coordinated suite of durable products and systems, from long-lived wood products, such as mass timber and wood energy systems, to biochar and activated carbon, linking established markets with practical long-term carbon sequestration, pollution remediation, and broader landscape scale benefits. Rather than focusing on a single technology, the discussion will examine how combining multiple biomass utilization pathways can support durable carbon removal, forest and watershed health, and real-world deployment at scale. Speakers will address system design and testing approaches, recommended intervention strategies, and how these tools can be integrated across forest and watershed contexts. As part of the discussion, Howard Sprouse, one of our featured speakers, will share an applied example from his work, an in-stream carbon filtration system designed to capture pollutants. The system was invented by Sprouse and is now patented and deployed by an environmental services firm. He will also discuss how related biological and carbon-based processes can be applied at household scale by homeowners. I will go ahead and introduce both Howard and Jim now, and then I will hand it over to Howard, and then Jim will follow. Howard Sprouse is the CEO of the Remediators, Inc. Howard brings over 2 decades of experience in bioremediation and restoration ecology. The Remediators are known for their contribution to the field of micro-remediation as early commercializers of the technology. The remediators have continued to develop and expand the potential in the bioremediation industry with the creation of the integrated biological approach, which combines the use of mushrooms, microbes, and plants within custom-tailored systems to meet a variety of remediation and restoration challenges. Our second speaker is Jim Archuleta, who is mostly retired, but is also a biomass utilization consultant. Jim Archuleta is a forest soil scientist and biomass utilization expert with a career spanning wildfire response, soil restoration, NEPA analysis, and wood innovation. I will hand it over to you, Howard.
Hi, well, thank you for the introduction, and everybody who's participating and listening today. My name's Howard Sprouse, and anyway, that I've been working kind of around this field on and off for over 30 years now, and I think that there's something really interesting about our group today that are speaking together. We all come from slightly different disciplines. And these disciplines are overlapping now. And so, with that, what I'll do is introduce how I think they're overlapping and what I think is really important now and the opportunities that exist for us all to work together. And so anyway, with my background in this has been really one of long-term interest in the local environment. I'm talking to you from the Olympic Peninsula. You can look out the window and see Canada from here. Look out another window. We look up toward Olympic National Park. And over the years, I've been fortunate in being able to participate either as an active participant or as a visitor to some of the scientific research that has been done in the park. For instance, global warming study. The first one conducted by the National Park Service was done right here at a place that you can almost drive to up at Hurricane Ridge, which is a real popular vacationing spot and visitor destination in the area. And the link between it and the discussion today is the fact that the project was looking at major forest overstory zones, in this case, the upper altitude region that Douglas fir grows in, and then the habitat that subalpine fir grows in. And both of these trees, they have different metabolism, and their needle leaf structure are different. One like in the case of subalpine fir, is able to close off cells in its needles in the wintertime, preserving the life and the moisture that's inside of them. Where, excuse me, Douglas fir doesn't have that ability. And so now, as we look at a world where there is rapid change in our forest habitats, and as we look at management practices that are created to take advantage of the opportunity that nature is giving us, we're able to glean information from a lot of this kind of research that I was able to be on the fringe of here, and use it for the creation of new management models. And so there's another unique thing about life on the Olympic Peninsula. We just had a big dam taken out not that many years ago. And it was at the time the largest dam removal project in the nation. And the thing that is distinctive about the river that was undammed was that at one time, the largest king salmon on earth came out of this river, the Elwha River. And that there were hopes and I'll say hopeful words that were expressed early on in putting fish ladders in, and that never did happen, and other things did happen that changed the environment for the fisheries that the area supported. So anyway, after removing the dam, the Park Service felt that their mission it was unique, and the mission was to regrow a natural forest that was made up of plants that came out of this watershed. And so the Park Service, they went on a widespread seed collecting efforts that they expended here, making sure that they were taking representatives of all of the plant and tree species that were there. And when I became involved in the project, which was kind of in and out of it, but at this time I can hardly believe it. It's been almost 50 years since I came here after graduating from high school. But I've been involved in some way over the years as these studies started to happen. And so I suggested to the National Park Service that we include biochar into this mission that they had of regrowing a native forest, and that we also included some of the other organisms here. And my specialty was working with mushrooms, with fungi. And so we went out on collection efforts to collect what they call mycorrhizal fungi, which are these mushrooms that associate with dominant plant species. Mostly the conifers, I'll say, are the ones that have been of greatest interest to people over the years. And so a group of my student interns from our local college and volunteers that worked with the restoration greenhouses here, we went out, we gathered mushrooms and we gathered soil that came from underneath these things. And we made some attempts to get them to grow and to form these things called mycorrhizas, which are in essence just an encapsulation of these plant roots with the type of fungi that you're introducing. And well, we had some response, and we did see some mycorrhizal development on some of these little baby seedling conifers that we applied our concoctions to, and we really weren't prepared at the time to do actual genetic testing, and so we don't really know what started to grow on there, but we did witness this. So anyway, um, going way back for me to early college days, botany classes, botany program, the instructor, a fellow named Ed Tisch, he would point out to his students every time he'd see some charcoal that was in the forest soils here. And he'd say, look at this, there's charcoal here. And so we have this long-term evidence of forest fires that have transformed the way that our soils develop. And we didn't really know what function they had at the time, although reaching back that long ago, back into the 1970s, there were fire scientists that were working for within a national park system around North America that were beginning to look at these things and see what effect charcoal, what effect forest fires had in the development of soil ecosystems. And so, in the intervening years, back when Tom Vilsack was the head of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, he looked at biochar, which is I guess, simply stated, it's a type of charcoal that's made from harvested biomass, and it's combusted in a certain way to give specific objectives that have to do with its ability and pH and other things like this. And so anyway, this is where when Jim Archuleta and I and others met, it was during the development years of figuring out how to make this stuff, how to use it, and what its effects are. And over these years, I ended up working on projects involving biochar that included some workforce development funding through our state and working with the state, looking at certain invasive plant species as having some potential to add biomass that not only ended up with a product that normally, well, it hadn't been made and marketed before, but also to figure out the methods of making it and what the options are. And so that's kind of how I focused on it. My company works primarily in cleaning up toxic sites, but there's a blur in between um, restoration ecology, the restoring of land, the management of timber, um, and the cleanup of our waters and our soils. And we've learned a lot over the years in what the limitations are, the way that we study these things. And so, you know, that the kind of the gold standard in working with natural organisms or working with chemicals to figure out what they do um, have been laboratory tests. And you have what they call mesocosm trials, bucket trials, and different things like this that allow you to put the things that you're testing and see what effects they have on the growth of things like mushrooms and plants and stuff like that. The problems that emerge from doing this is the limitations that are imposed when we take any organism or group of organisms into a laboratory and try to mimic the great outdoors. There's really no substitute for that. And so what we have done is that we try as quickly as possible to identify these different groups of potential um, uh, um, constituents, I guess we could call them, of a restoration or remediation plan and get it outside as quickly as possible. But we still go through the laboratory procedures that allow us to start to identify them and see where they might be most useful. So that's sort of what I've been doing over the years, primarily functioning in the cleanup of toxic soils and water, but also in participating in some of these great restoration efforts. And now working with our local colleagues and fellows, we have the opportunity to integrate some of this knowledge into future management of our native forests that are found that are within some of the local native reservation areas on the Olympic Peninsula and elsewhere. So I'd like any of you to be able to interrupt me or really any of us as we're talking here. And I do have some slides and a PowerPoint that I had sent that we could quickly run through those if you'd like now, and just see some pictures that I brought along what we've been doing. I think you're there. Yeah, this is the one that I think we should focus on here. And um, this is the integrated biological approach. And over the years, like I started working on microremediation first as a consultant to the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And we were looking at mushrooms effects and being able to clean up the environment and specific compounds. And we found they work really good on some things. They work good on being able to work with nutrients and to work with hydrocarbons and compounds that can be easily broken down. But then what do? We would end up working on these cleanups. And at the end of it, if they had toxic metals in there, the metals were still in the soil. If they had other toxic compounds that we couldn't completely break down, they ended up just sort of munching away on the edges of the toxins, but not being able to do the whole thing. And so we started adding things into it. And the first and simplest thing that we started to do is to start using plants and what I call a vegetative cap on these treatment piles. And so at the time, there had been a number of companies that for remediation projects, all they did was plant clover. So we planted clover. And this did a couple of things for us. One is it allowed us to work with these sites and not use a lot of black plastic. And so we had been used to seeing remediation sites covered with plastic, and they don't look anything at all natural. And so by using these vegetative caps, we were able to stop having to use black plastic. Well, another thing started happening though. As soon as we did that, our fungal treatments that I call myco treatments, they started lasting longer. And they did that. We just had to surmise it was because there were some interactions going on there. And what we discovered eventually is that in the soil environment, in the root zones of where these plants are, there's a lot of potential for the exchange of nutrients. And we didn't really even know anything about the effects of microbes at the time. But as our work became more visible to people, I started working with one of the professors at the University of Washington who had focused on plants and primarily what they were calling hyperaccumulating plants. And these were largely different types of poplars, and they had been treating these plants' roots with different kinds of bacterial microbes. And the response that they got both were visible differences in how these plants thrived, but also differences in the types of contaminants that they were able to start to break down. And so anyway, we began working with them and working with one of their contractors, which is a company out of NASA Ames Research Park in Mountain View, California, called Intrinsics, and they pretty much built their company on the use of these hybrid poplars of different types and microbes. And at this point, I just spoke with their CEO about a week ago. They've added to the suite of microbes that they have available that are showing good promise. And what they're doing is that as you start adding this other biology in there, they tend to break down their food sources and other things that are in there in different ways. And so with mushrooms, when they grow, everything they do happens outside the cell wall. They excrete these enzymes that start to break things down. Then they reabsorb it and turn it into mushroom mycelium and tissue, and eventually make mushrooms themselves. Well, with these microbes that they you can talk about them in different ways, the way that the way that they associate with plants, but they call them endophytes in one of the ways. And what these are microscopic microbes that live inside the plants, the plant roots and the plant tissues. And the way that they make their living is a little bit different than the fungi. And so this graph here, as we start looking at it, on the left, we're looking at biochar at the top, endophytes and microbes, phytoremediation, which is the use of these plants, and mycoremediation, which is the use of fungi. They all work in a different way independently. But then going to the complete right side of my simple graph here, I've kind of pointed out the areas in which these seem to be performing the best, and the synergies involved is that we're able to reduce all of these contaminants at once as we combine them. And so that's a real simple way of talking about the integrated biological approach. It's a suite of different biochar, endophytes, microbes, plants, the phytoremediation and the mycoremediation work together. And depending on what they're working on, they either can completely break down these toxic compounds, or they behave in a way that they make them soluble, and the plants themselves uptake them, or the biochar that we use, that are again made of what we thought yesterday about as waste biomass, the stuff of slash piles that get burnt. We can turn this into products that affect the work and affect the economy around it in different ways. One, for instance, is simply to improve the performance of different types of soils and their ability to support plant life. And then the other way is to interact chemically with these soluble contaminants and either absorb them or adsorb them, or in the case of certain types of biochar, which if you visualize through a microscope, are full of tiny holes that represent different components of those plant tissues when they were alive. And in those, these microbes, microbial endophytes, they can find a home in there too. And so the biochar can also be used as a remediation agent, as part of this synergistic cleanup approach. Okay, next slide. Okay, that I've already described that pretty much. Okay, here we go. Now, we're all about timber in the Olympic Peninsula. We have some of the largest tree species of conifers anywhere on Earth. There are cedars, which is a tree that we were specifically focusing on together, the people that are in on this conversation today, in looking at its impact and how we can impact cedars and support ongoing growth of timber that's based on these things. And so growing these types of trees. So anyway, years ago, nobody would have dreamed that there would be a business just making wood chips. And there wouldn't be a logger around that would drive up and see a tree and say, oh, won't that make a nice chip? But making wood chips is a big deal here. And this is scene from Herman Brothers Logging, which is a major manufacturer of wood chips. They take them and they are sorted. The trees are sorted that they came from according to their species, and they're put in these piles, and they end up being used in different ways. And so the pickup here with a flatbed trailer behind it, inside of those bags, they are full of a fungal mycotreatment that also has some biochar in there that we made for one of our jobs, and it's we're in the lineup waiting to go through the scales that day. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now this is a photograph of a project that was done by Dr. Ron Zelazny, who works for the University of Agriculture. It's one of the champions of using different tree species as buffers, barriers, and actual treatment for toxic properties. And so this is a photograph looking down at the placement of some of these hyperaccumulating trees that he has in a toxic cleanup site. We've worked with Dr. Velazny, by the way. Next slide, please. Okay, when we started out, we were just working with fungi. This is kind of best case scenario of a cleanup of spilled diesel at a fuel transfer plant down in Ilwaco that we, over just a few months, were able to reduce the amount of diesel, which when we came into the job, you could see it. And if you put some of the soil into a bucket with water, you would see it, a sheen floating on the surface. You could smell it. And here we were able to just mix it up and walk away and come back a few months later. And it was, had essentially broke down all of the diesel hydrocarbons in there. And the way that mushrooms do this is that from a chemical perspective, they don't really distinguish between whether the hydrocarbon that they're consuming as food came from material that was destined to go into a fuel tank of a truck or a home heating oil, or if it's a natural hydrocarbon from wood that is rotting out in forest environment. Next slide, please. Okay, this Cotton Lake, Alaska is in the largest wetland in the United States, in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. And it's a couple of dozen miles from the Yukon on the Cotton Lake River. This grassland that you see here is very typical of certain parts of that environment. In the background, you could see some of the deciduous trees that grow there. They had a lot of mountain alder and stuff like that. Now, when they built the original fuel transfer facility there, you know, steel rusts away, and they started leaking, and it leaked into this, and so what we're looking at here is a new fuel transfer facility went in there. They hadn't yet cleaned up the toxins that were in the soil around there, and it's beautiful. You don't want to go in and dig this up, and so we came up with a method with our partners down there at Intrinsics, where we would come in with gas-powered post-hole augers, and backfill the holes and plant them with these native poplars from up there that have been treated with the endophytes, that have biochar in there mixed in with the soil medium and microtreatment, and and lay it out in a pattern so that the roots, as the plants grow, have a chance to contact each other and get broad coverage of it, and clean this up without destroying it while we're trying to clean it up. But from the perspective of how it looks anyway. So next slide, please. And here is our site plan, and each of the yellow circles represents one of the native poplar trees from up in Alaska, and they're about 7 feet apart here, and there would be enough interaction between the root zones as these things grow after the first year or two, that they would have good coverage to be able to get at the pollutants that are in there. And then the green circles around the perimeter of the existing tank farm would be a barrier from any of the materials that would be difficult to access that are underneath the big platform that these fuel tanks are on. And that's more of a buffer in that area. But now in this case, we've been encouraging some of these local communities toward looking at biochar as something that they can make right there and that they can use for their own cleanup, but also that this can be aggregated and then used on larger cleanups in Alaska. For instance, I think it's about 50 miles from here, it might be less, is one of the largest lead mines in North America, and it's in need of cleanup. And so we would have the potential, thinking back to the slide I showed you of Dr. Ron Zalesny's work and in our work, of being able to use these materials right up there, pretty much on the land that they came from, that they were made from, as part of the ongoing cleanup efforts. Next slide, please. Okay, now here is a graph that really I think if you just look at the red lines, it's sufficient. This is on a project that we did with our partners at Intrinsics. This one was at Dos Palos at a bulk fuel transfer facility, and you can see in this case the winners are the lines that are the shortest here, and the ones where we blended the use of these phytoremediation trees and then the endophytes and then the mycelium microtreatment that we provided. They started being able to transform the toxicity in those environments and get rid of it. And in that case, the way that they measured it is through what they call carbon flux measurements, which are different ways of being able to look at the transformation of these hydrocarbons in soils and know where they came from and know where they're going to. And so anyway, that we were very, very excited when we started working together on this. And it allowed the oil company to be able to remove their very expensive and not functioning system that they had in there. Yeah, Jim, could you put up what you just told me again, and I'll mention it. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a soil mixture with biochar that's being used on a PFAS removal project for the toxicology lab that we work with at Port Gamble. And this is a blend that was formulated, the recipe was formulated by our State Department of Ecology. Next slide, please. Okay, here's are the trees down in Dos Palos. And anyway, a lot of them had to be replaced after they died when they were first planted, and then these are the ones that are beginning to grow again after we started mixing our biochar in with. No, I think Jim, why don't you go ahead and talk about the ponderosa pines treatment? You're more familiar with that than me. I'll just pass it over to you and encourage anybody who has any questions when we have time here to answer them or answer them afterwards. Send us emails.
Sure, I'll bring it up in my discussion when I think I find an apropos moment.
Yeah.
All right, I'll start sharing my screen. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is how do we get to the level of work that Howard's talking about. One of the things that kind of stuck with me early on is when I became interested in biochar, I remember running up to the forest timber manager and telling him all about biochar at this conference that we were at, and he kind of stood there shaking his head. Yes, that sounds good. That sounds good. That sounds good. And then once I took a breath and he was able to get something in edgewise, he just looked at me point blank and, well, how are you going to pay for it? That kind of set me back on my haunches. So that led me down this odyssey that I've been going for the last few years in trying to figure out exactly that. How do we pay for it? And how do we improve land management and wildfire risk simultaneously? So first, let's look at what's going on for most land managers. And almost in every case, wildfire risk is what's going to drive the vegetative practices for federal, state, private levels, tribal levels, regardless of who's out there. Wildfire is a large part, if not the driving point that they need to deal with. So what does that mean for us? And in that, let's take a look at what a lot of the wildfire forest fuels managers deal with. So our risk of ignition is not from timber. It's not the greater than 8-inch diameter logs that are out there that people normally think about when we harvest timber. It's from the less than 8-inch diameter material. That's where the risk of ignition and spread is from. It's just like a campfire. You don't start the logs on fire. You have to start the kindling that heats the logs to the point where they then ignite. And that's what we have to deal with in wildfire risk, is break that fuel continuity so that even if we have a wildfire, the pre-treatment or the preheating of the larger wood doesn't occur. So like I say here, when we break the continuity across the fuel sizes on the ground, we also limit that flame length ability to climb up into the canopy. And by removing that, we don't exclude fire, but we reduce the risk that fire can cause and the damage. So, what are the common vegetative management practices that we have? Foresters tend to rely on timber sales for extraction. There's regeneration, harvest. A lot of people recognize that as clear cut. regeneration to the Forest Service, though, is there's at least a 15% retention. So you can have 100 acres, but only 85 acres are actually clear cut. There's a 15% retention in that boundary. So that's why there's a little bit of difference between the nomenclature. And then there's thinning, which is coming and taking a certain selection of the stand and not opening up as widely, just opening the spaces between the trees. Then there's sanitation, where we have infestation, or there's root rot, or there's some kind of biologic agent out there that's causing stand damage, and we want to deal with it through sanitizing the timber stand. And then there's salvage, when we have wildfire occurrences, but we have to remove some measure of the standing timber and the down timber to prevent a reburn effect. So I've seen that because I was on a forest long enough to actually be there during the 1996 spring fire on the Umpqua National Forest. And then I was also still there in 2008 when we had the rattle fire on the same footprint. And what had happened is there was no extraction from the spring fire. And then in that interim between 1996 and 2008, we had two things occurred. There was tree planting, and then there was a lot of brush that grew up beneath the trees that fell down. And what that did was it created a fuel load that allowed even the 36-inch diameter logs that were there to be completely consumed in the rattle fire. And that heat altered the soil and created an erosion effect that we also want to avoid. So that's the long-term thinking that we need to remember, is that if we have an incident, we definitely want to deal with some measure of the vegetation, be it alive or dead, and try to reduce the effects of the next fire. And that's kind of where this whole thing goes for me. And then we have the actual fuels reduction activities, such as chipping, which can be an extraction. You can chip for like the picture that Howard showed earlier from that logging outfit. And then there's pre-commercial thinning. This is where we're just going to go in and knock down some trees to, well, they're not really trees, they're more or less poles, and knock those down so that the trees that we do leave alive are actually able to overcome and rise up a little bit farther and faster. And we reduce the competition. And then we have mastication, where we go in with, essentially a big mower, and we just mow down the vegetation. So those are the most common treatments that we have. All of these things, the timber sale can pay for the land treatment if the value of the wood is sufficient enough to pay for the rebuilding of the roads, the reforestation, the restoration and work of both obliterating some roads and potentially upgrading culverts and doing any number of things. Now, when we do fuels reduction, you can't really afford to do that because you're not really extracting much of anything. So we start getting into problems in how do we pay for these things. So once again, that leads us to thinking that we need to start managing that biomass in a way that we can deal with it and actually not have to appropriate so much money from the Treasury, because we do have that. It is a resource out there, and if we manage it appropriately and monetize it appropriately, we can manage more acres. So, as I kind of pointed out, the path to biomass monetization is not a direct path, and it may have to go through a sort yard. Right now, when we're dealing with biomass, we tend to use the timber sale model. So that increases the cost because you have to send money to the Treasury. You have to pay for the roads to be rehabilitated. You have to pay for the sale area improvement to be done and replanting the trees and, like I said, culverts and all those other things. And then you also have to do the brush disposal. So if you're a industrial firewood purchaser, you have to pay for all of those for trust funds. However, if you were to request full utilization, you could avoid the last of the trust funds because there is no pile to burn. There is no brush disposal. You're walking away with the entirety of it. It's not necessarily a lot of money, depending upon where you're at and what timber sale or what activity you happen to have. Sometimes it doesn't quite pencil out. But if you have a product in a sort yard or a suite of products, you'll be better suited to absorb the costs of having to move that material. And sorting potentially reduces the waste for the end user. So let's say you have a sort yard that identifies posts and poles for hops, for hop farming. So those poles, if you're manufacturing poles, they're anywhere from 4 to 6 inches in diameter, less than 24 foot long. Well, that's a specification, and you can sort those logs out and reduce the waste that would go from your sort yard, or that pole manufacturer would have to deal with normally. But you're keeping it at the sort yard and potentially turning it into the biochar that Howard would then be able to use in the remediation work that he's talking about. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that it's a bit of a convoluted route, but it is what it is. And biomass is by no means, it's not what people are striving to work on, because you're robbing Peter to pay Paul sometimes in the work. But, if you do it right, potentially you can get it to work out. So by having this effective landscape wildfire risk reduction, that's the thing, is I did mention that, we've been doing this a while, since the 1970s, actually, and it still isn't happening. The problem is we have all of these, the issues that are associated with timber sales compound the problems that we already have with biomass, which is a low valued material anyway. And by not dealing with it up front, we're hopefully, we can potentially get rid of that if we start to look at how we could take mass timber and wood energy and biochar just as the overall topics and fill in the gaps between those three opportunities. So between mass timber, which is taking smaller diameter logs, laminating them, milling them out, laminating them into larger timbers, that work has allowed up to 18-story buildings here in the Portland area to be built with wood. So if we have that, and we can sort out for that specific product, we can create a condition to where we can start to pay for the haul and pay for the movement. As I mentioned earlier, we're potentially avoiding the the brush disposal trust fund, with at least within the federal timber sales. So there are ways that you can take the little pieces of or little pots of money that are on the table and repurpose them into another application. And hopefully we can take these opportunities in their sorting, better monetize the biomass that we have and produce something at scale. So some of the products that could come from a sort yard, as I've mentioned, mass timber, which is cross-laminated timber, or laminated panels and columns. You typically need a 2x6 to make to use the board in the laminated panel or column. So that's a greater than 8-inch diameter log. Mass timber panels or mass plywood panels are actually made from veneers, and they can be manufactured from a less than 5-inch diameter log, which is greater than 8 feet long. So if you find that material in a burn pile that you've relocated to your sort yard, you have the potential of setting that aside, decking it until you can get in a big enough pile to then sell it off to these manufacturers. You could also at that site have a custom milling operation, a wood miser or other small mill that could custom cut variety of woods that you'd find during the process. As I mentioned earlier, if you have greater than 6-inch diameter logs that are greater than 30 foot or 30 foot or greater, you could potentially mill them down into dowels, which become poles. Firewood, which would be anywhere from 3 inches in diameter to 6-inch diameter, is characteristic of what industrial splitters use. You could potentially use the heat that you could make down here to create kiln dried firewood. Subsequently, in all of this sorting, you're finding the smallest piece of wood that could be used in clean wood chips, which would be less than 2% bark, potentially debarked. Sometimes you don't have to. If you have enough large wood in there, you can get by with a little bit of bark, put into a high capacity tub grinder, making clean chips. Or, you could have hog fuel that comes through and guts and feathers goes into that. All of this could also simultaneously be making wood energy, biochar, and it then disposes of the last remnants of the materials that were hauled into the sort yard into these products. You can make that either with a closed kiln, which is a pyrolysis unit. Actually, typically you're going to need to prepare that wood chip to put into the pyrolysis unit. You're not going to stuff branches and tops in there. You're going to make it into chips most of the time, for dependent upon the unit. And then there's the very simple air curtain incinerators that a lot of people know and use. And I see Roger Smullen is on here, so he uses one or uses them pretty consistently. That requires only the chainsaw preparation before you throw in a greater or less than 16-inch diameter, less than 12-foot log into the incinerator. And then if you don't have that high-end capacity or don't need to necessarily use to create energy, you can just do complete disposal to capture biochar and do that with flame cap kilns to conservation burns. These are just a pile of wood that's been stacked appropriately and burned from the top down to maximize the amount of biochar that you create. So the thing about this is sometimes you have a limited range, and I'm going to kind of go over this real quick, but maybe it's best to start with this. So if you have a sort yard, let's say we have a sort yard at Cave Junction, and you have the capacity or the range of collection for 50 miles out. You have a bit of land that could be managed there. And let's say the people in Medford now decided that they wanted to have a sort yard. You have continuity of management from Klamath all the way to Crater Lake. However, let's say that the next sort yard is this would be up here around Tokenie Falls or Tokenie Ranger Station where I used to work. Then you start to have a gap in the ability to deal with that, and that's where you can use the mobile biochar equipment that Roger Smolin or Air Burners Incorporated or anybody else that's using that mobile equipment can go fill that gap and still give the land manager continuity management from Klamath now all the way, practically all the way up to, close to Bend. So that's the concept of being able to use these things in concert. It's not going to be one. It's going to have to be a series of them, and they're going to either overlap and create a Venn diagram where they overlap under this scenario some point, or you fill in the gaps where you don't have the ability to manage that material without a mobile system. And what this allows us to do is essentially redistribute the surplus organic matter that we have in the forest and take it to areas of deficit. So if we were to think about the areas of deficit up here, we definitely know that the soils in and around Bend could use a lot of organic material because the only thing that they can produce is lodgepole pine. However, if we could increase the soil structure and density of that soil with some biochar and ultimately increase the soil organic matter, we could switch to create ponderosa pine and grassland savannas that are easier to manage on the landscape, especially when we do prescribed underburning. So that's kind of the general crux of what I have been getting at, is that, yeah, we can do this biochar stuff and we can do all this other stuff, but it's going to take more than just the biochar alone. It's going to take partnering and collaborating with a lot of other groups and a lot of other industries for us to be able to move the level of biomass that we need to move. And I do want to put a bit of a shout out now to the Wood Innovation Grants just dropped yesterday. So if you're not aware of what these are, these are a series of grants that could potentially give folks the opportunity if they have, so it's a one-to-one match. If you have $100,000 for your project and you're selected, the Forest Service will come at you with another $100,000. So consider that an opportunity too. And it just happens that it dropped yesterday, so I wanted to make sure that folks are aware of that. And I used to manage the regionals, the Oregon and Washington's program for the Forest Service, and it's an excellent program if you have the opportunity to use it. And I'll open for questions.
Thank you, Jim. Let's see. I think I will start with a couple of questions for both you and Howard, and then we'll open it up for the room. First question to you, Howard, is anyone commercially making biochar-based pollution remediation systems, and does he know where to find info on cost and revenue potential of their use of forest biomass? It's also in the chat. That question, that's from Brad.
Yeah, you know what I would suggest everybody do that has questions that are like this, go to the U.S. Biochar Initiative's website. And this is a really great spot to be able to figure out who's doing what where and in your area of the country. And that's my suggestion. I think that if I answer that question personally from where we're at right here right now, is that there's need for unique preparations and uses of biochar. And the thing that Jim Archuleta spoke to here with the Wood Innovations grants that are coming out, and with the independent work that companies like mine have done. We all have our own ways that we've been approaching this, and we've seen things that are areas of need. I believe that the greatest area of need right now for the development of small scale integrated markets is the development of more improved, what I'm calling entry level biochar kilns. And so this is something that we've been working on, that I and our colleagues. Uh, how do we build something that is affordable for a small company, that they can take out into the forest and put to work? And the other part of that hurdle, though, is an administrative piece, because there are regulations on anything that uses fire for production that need to be met. And so in the past, we have been lucky that we've been able to work with the Department of Ecology on a R&D basis for this stuff, but we really need to support legislation that accepts that biochar production in the field, mobile kilns, in making materials out of nothing, basically, at this point, is something that is legal and accepted to do.
Well, and in that realm, so a lot of the, at least from the federal standpoint, from the federal timber sales that I was working on, all it's really going to take is a little bit of adaptation in the planning process. If folks were to understand that you're doing an extraction with the biomass, they may actually show less of an impact. So using a mobile biochar kiln would actually decrease the risk to the soils. And I didn't point it out, but one of the issues with burn piles as they are now are holdover fires. We had the what was it, Hermit Peak Calf Canyon fire in New Mexico. That was the New Mexico state's largest wildfire in its history, and it was from a Forest Service burn pile. So what happened is the pile burned, and it created enough heat to transfer that heat beneath the soil into some buried organic matter that burned for months. And then once the snow was gone and the winds kicked up, as the winds kicked up, it was throwing embers, and it created a wildfire. So by doing that, you're very able, you can eliminate that risk. You can literally eliminate the risk of holdover fires.
This brings up an interesting point that we have a lot of these wetland prairies on the Olympic Peninsula, and the native peoples from here use them traditionally for all kinds of food, from camas to different sorts of berries, and they happen to be great spots to hunt too. And anyhow, they managed them by burning. And by selective periodic burning, it accomplishes a number of things. One of the things is it prevents the encroachment of other timber species. We will be seeing more of this in the future as things warm up and dry out. That prescribed burning is a tool, and it is a beneficial tool if done properly at the proper time of year, that actually ends up protecting us from fires, from bigger fires. We had a local mill here that had a fire that burned underground like the one you're speaking of in the rainforest for years, And that something really interesting came out of that at the time, when logging and timber was really king here, there were people that were going into really hard to harvest areas building roads. And so when you're talking about putting a road in through some swamplands, what one of the cedar mill found is, as he was doing excavation to put in a logging road, he found trees that had been buried for thousands of years, stacked up on top of each other, that were not rotten, that are just there, and they're still there. They're still there. There's so much that we don't know about what's underfoot, and how to manage it. And one of the points that was brought up early on in this discussion was talking about culvert replacement, and that we do this to reconnect streams, to allow fish passage, for instance. One of the things we don't do, though, is that we haven't come up with good strategies where there are bridges and culverts to prevent toxins from coming off of our roads, getting back into the stream, through these features that we just put there to improve the environment. And we can do something about that by approaching it using biochar in the ways that Jim and I have been talking about.
Jim, I have a question for you. Can a multi-product approach that you were talking about, does it need any entity who would take on this approach? Would they have to be close to a mill? In other words, are mills essential as infrastructure for the sorting yards, the central materials handling, and just complementary product stream?
No, I brought all of this forward because of one of the things that was so previous to my work in the Wood Innovations group. There was a fellow by the name of Rusty Dram, and in that group, he wrote a series of papers about sort yards and bringing them back. So sort yards used to be the thing, and one of the things that they would do is they were aggregating the wood in the forest. So they were creating a load for this mill and a load for that mill, and actually that reduced the amount of waste at the mill. So I think we could do the same thing if we had the specifications. If the given sort yard were to have the area's specifications for the consumers, they would be able to build a pile for Herbert lumber over here and Freris lumber over here, and then everybody would get that material and actually have less waste at the other end. And then that sort yard could potentially use some kind of equipment. I'll just use Air Burner's biocharger as an example. Is that unit is similar to what Roger Smullen uses, but it also produces electricity and thermal offtake. So they could also be manufacturing firewood on site and making biochar on site with that as they're making their heat and electricity. And that the electricity that they're producing is powering or charging batteries that operate the equipment that do the loading and moving. So, no, you don't have to be right next to a mill. You could potentially aggregate for the mill, and you could get a 6 month or 5 year stay in a rock quarry on a national forest.
Great. Well, last question from me, and then we will open it up to everyone else. And this is to both Howard and Jim. Since we think through a lot of the carbon dioxide removal schemes, including sequestration and storage and the carbon market, can you just briefly talk about how you see both of your work contributing to that potentiality down the road as the carbon markets it gets stronger?
I'll start out, Howard.
Okay.
So in talking about I apologize, Brad. I didn't throw that in for the mass timber in my little presentation, but there is work ongoing now to show that all the way from mass timber to biochar, that there is a carbon offset benefit, because when we're using mass timber, we're actually avoiding steel and concrete, which have a very high carbon footprint. So, and we're using a renewable resource as opposed to something that, once you deconstruct concrete, you have to crush it up again and potentially use it if you're going to use it again. If not, you're just going to fill a hole with it somewhere. These panels can be taken down and reused, and there are folks that are even talking about figuring out how to take down those 18-story structures and repurpose the wood somewhere else. So, and on top of that, some of these structures are they're earthquake proof. They recently did a test in I believe it was San Diego, where they stood up a mass timber building and replicated the what was it, the 1989 earthquake in San Francisco, and it didn't do anything. I mean, the building was fine, the structure that they had left up. So these not only are very valuable pieces of construction, they're going to last a good while. The wood energy stuff potentially has the offtake of biochar, giving us a material that can be sequestering carbon for thousands of years. I mean, as a soil scientist at Diamond Lake, I was finding charcoal that had been consumed in the explosion of Mount Mazama 7,500 years ago. I'm still digging it up. So that's the length of this carbon sequestration, is thousands of years. Once we lock it into that stable form and put it in the soil, as long as it doesn't physically move somewhere else, it's just right there.
Yeah, this is a good point, and the fact that Jim brought up about mass timber, that we have a local company, CRTC, at our airport, Port Angeles, and the probably the lowest value timber here on the peninsula is hemlock, and it also is, if you happen to be a carpenter, it has particularly low value to you, because it is not something that is structurally, nor can withstand rot like Douglas fir, for instance, or cedar. And so anyway, CRTC they're literally cooking this wood in both veneer form as well as lumber and panels made of chipped materials, and it changes the physical properties of it, and it's a process that actually, I think if we look back far enough, we'll probably find it was made by the people manufacturing wooden skis in Norway, Sweden years ago, that have what they call lignostone edges. And in that case, it was beech wood that was cooked. And when it gets cooked, it starts to literally melt the polymer, which is a random sheet polymer that is what is one of the components of wood, changes its property and turns it into something extremely durable. And so the company here in town are making panels out of this that are being used in construction. And interestingly, one of the first bigger jobs that they had was making a structure that is up on the Arctic slope somewhere, being used to monitor earthquakes.